Hello everyone, and welcome to today's ACT, Accelerating CCUS Technologies Storage Project Joint Webinar. My name is Brian Allison. I am the UK National Contact Point for this international CCUS R&D programme. I work in the BEIS CCUS team with responsibilities for CCUS R&D and international collaboration policy. We'll be hearing from 4 ACT projects today: ELEGANCY, ALIGN-CCUS, PreACT, and Detect. These were 4 of the 5 UK ACT 1 projects. For ACT 2, the UK had 10 ACT projects. And currently, we are looking at evaluating another 54 UK projects under the ACT 3 scheme. I'll take you through the agenda in a second, but before I do that, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping items so that you know how to participate in today's event. Next slide. You have joined this webinar using your computer speaker system, but by default, if you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Next slide. You have the opportunity to submit questions and comments to the presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane on your control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. These will be collected and they will be addressed during the question and answer session at the end, once we've heard from all 4 projects. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to view on the ALIGN-CCUS project website soon after the event. Next slide. An exciting part. We have a poll. So, how do we do these? So some of today's presenters will conduct a live poll for the audience, with the audience, asking questions that you'll be answering in real time. Simply click on your preferred answer and press submit. You'll be given a few seconds to do that. Next slide. And then the next slide. Okay, the agenda. Once I've finished, we're going to go through the 4 projects in order. We'll go through ELEGANCY, followed by ALIGN-CCUS, PreACT, and then Detect. Now, you can access the bios from the panel. Okay, so the handouts panel, you can select and you can get the bio. So I'm going to save time by not introducing in great detail our excellent panel today. And we will have a question and answer session at 12 and finish promptly just after 12:25. Next slide. With great pleasure, I would like to introduce Jonathan Pearce, who will go through the ELEGANCY project with you. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to just give you a quick introduction to the ELEGANCY project, or actually a very small part of the ELEGANCY project. You should see this as also an introduction to Maxine's talk that she's going to give straight after on some of the work that has also been completed in the ALIGN project. Because these 2 projects are, we like to think of them as sister projects, and some of the work has been undertaken in common across both projects to ensure that we have a common set of inputs, if you like, common set of scenarios and constraints for some of the work that we've been doing here on the future of CO2 storage in the UK. So my talk this morning is really going to set the scene by asking the question, how much storage capacity will the UK actually need for a low carbon industry cluster to meet future carbon budgets? So I'll just switch off my camera and then I will ask for the next slide. So the ELEGANCY project is designed to enable a low carbon economy via the production of hydrogen. That production of hydrogen in the ELEGANCY project is considered primarily from the reformation of natural gas, with the production of hydrogen and also the capturing and storage of carbon dioxide. So I'm not going to deal too much in the benefits of hydrogen as a low carbon energy carrier. I'm sure many of you understand that in some detail. The other objectives of the ELEGANCY project were to validate key elements of the CCS chain through some experimental work across that chain, across that full chain, to optimize the combined systems for hydrogen production and the separation of carbon dioxide, to de-risk the storage of CO2 that's produced by this natural gas reforming of hydrogen, to enable the safe and cost-efficient design of key elements of the CCS chain through the development and testing of a number of design and simulation tools. Importantly, to provide a techno-economic design and operation simulation tool for the full chain, and to assess some of the societal support that might be needed for key elements of that deployment of hydrogen and CCS. So they're the high-level objectives of the project. But today I'm really going to, as I say, set the scene and look at the amount of CO2 storage capacity that we might imagine is needed for CO2 storage to enable this hydrogen economy to develop in the UK. So if I could have the next slide, please. So the ELEGANCY project has within it 5 case studies, 5 national case studies, and through these case studies we have addressed those objectives that I outlined on the previous slide. These case studies are focused on 5 countries in the UK, the Netherlands, Norway, Germany, and Switzerland. In the UK, we've been lucky to be able to work very closely with colleagues at Teesside, the industrial cluster there, and with the industrial region of Grangemouth in Scotland, through a good collaboration with INEOS Petrochemicals. We've also had lots and lots of discussions with many different industrial groups throughout the project, and for the UK there, you'll see that I've also listed the H1021 project, which when we started this project, the ELEGANCY project, some 3 years ago now, was really focused on the Leeds Citygate programme. Since then, the consortium has undertaken a number of subsequent reviews looking at how we might decarbonise the north of England through the creation of a hydrogen economy in that region, primarily focused on decarbonising domestic and industrial heat supply, but also looking at the potential for hydrogen use in heavy goods freight transport, either by road or rail. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we've always viewed this project as a sister, these activities within the ELEGANCY project as a sort of sister or counterpart to that undertaken in the ALIGN project, which we'll hear about in a minute from Maxine. And the real aim of this work that I'm going to be discussing is to really try and provide some estimates, some forecasts of the CO2 supply from our current position through to actually to 2100. And as you see, as I get to some of my later slides, much of those estimates are based, those sort of techno-economic estimates, if you like, are based or are limited to 2050 or thereabouts. but for the purposes of this study, we thought it would be beneficial to extend that to 2100. Primarily, the project research findings are applied to the H21 North of England study, the conversion of the gas network and domestic heating, primarily focused around 7 large cities in the north of England, to more or less 100% hydrogen use. Other work that we've undertaken in the ELEGANCY project, which I'm not going to talk about today, has been investigating the geomechanical stability of CO2 storage strata that might be impacted due to seasonal or daily fluctuations in CO2 supply. And all this work has been used to inform the constraints on the development of these chain integration tools that I mentioned for the subsurface storage of CO2 and hydrogen. And more information is available on the ELEGANCY website, which you can see at the bottom of your screen now. Next slide, please. So the objective really for this CO2 supply profiles, as we call them, is to create one scenario that will look at potential future pathways of CO2 storage development in the UK to try and understand, to constrain the amount of storage capacity that might be required, both at a national level and then in some detail focused around the two sites, the two industrial clusters that we have been primarily focused on, which is Grangemouth and Teesside. So this work really sets the scene for subsequent work in the ALIGN and ELEGANCY projects. So in ALIGN, as you'll hear from Maxine in a minute, we are trying to identify which storage sites might be best, might be those that you might bring on stream to meet that storage demand. And the ELEGANCY project, as I've already mentioned, is looking at the impacts of variable injection rates on both that injectivity and the geomechanical stability of some of those sites. So we've developed a series of pathways, which I'll discuss in a minute, with low, intermediate and high growth variance. And you'll get to see what they look like in the forthcoming slides. And the input for this has been a review, a detailed review of many concepts that have been published over the last few years, I'll say going back probably 5 years or so, where various industrial groups, where the Committee for Climate Change, for example, that's the UK independent advisory body to the UK government that provides advice on how the government might achieve its low carbon targets, which are broken down into a series of 5-yearly intervals, 5-yearly carbon budgets. And when we started this work back in 2018 or so, we were really targeting the 5th carbon budget, which runs from 2028 to 2032, and then looking at scenarios that other groups, other academic groups and industrial consortia have published just to explain how they could contribute to achieving that carbon reduction. Now, obviously, since this project was started, I think it's fair to say that our ambition has increased. We've moved very much to a position of achieving net zero. We are expecting this year or perhaps even next year in 2021 that the Committee on Climate Change will publish its 6th carbon budget, and in that will set out a pathway to achieve net zero for the UK. So it's fair to say that as we were undertaking this project, around us we were very aware that the overall level of ambition was moving quite rapidly. And so we undertook towards the end of the project an update of this review. But essentially, because of this development of these supply profiles were needed for the rest of this project, these are perhaps now considered to be slightly in need of some revision. Next slide, please. So the methodology that we adopted, as I say, we were lucky enough to have lots of support and discussions with various groups around the UK to develop our proposals, develop our concepts, and those concepts were tested, if you like, with those groups to make sure they fitted with the expectations as they were evolving over time. Here on the right of your screen, you can see just two examples of the kinds of inputs that we had. So the top image there is a very much a conceptual image of what a very well-developed hydrogen supply network might look like, based on some work that was undertaken in the H21 project. And at the bottom there is an early slide of the HyNet vision, if you like, for decarbonising the Liverpool-Manchester region, the northwest of England, through the development of a hydrogen network, hydrogen supply to energy-intensive industries and domestic users, with CO2 storage in the East Irish Sea. So we've taken a number of inputs, if you like, looking at the CCS potential in various industrial sectors, as defined in the UK's Clean Growth Strategy. We've looked at some of the early pre-FEED studies that were undertaken for Teesside. We've looked at Summit Power's concepts for an East Coast network for carbon capture and storage, and also looked at Acorn's estimates for the potential for CCS in Scotland. Similarly, for applying CCS in support of the production of hydrogen, we've looked at studies undertaken by the Northern Gas Network for the Leeds Citygate project, the H21 Roadmap Cadence HyNet project, and work undertaken within ELEGANCY by our partners, particularly at Imperial College for INEOS at the Grangemouth refinery. So these and a number of other inputs have been used to try and develop a series of CO2 supply curves that we might expect to go out from the east coast of the UK to the North Sea. Next slide, please. So from these reviews, we've generated a scenario that has three variants in it, a low, intermediate and high. This looks at the potential growth, if you like, of deployment of CO2 capture, both in industry and for the production of hydrogen over time, moving out to 2050, with some constraint on that, some modelling of that, technical economic modelling of that, and then some simple extrapolations beyond that. So we have three variants: an initial projects variant, which is mainly focused on industrial capture of CO2 from industrial point sources at Teesside and Grangemouth, and then moving on to a growth and extension of that through other projects, looking at the onset of hydrogen production, for example, in around Teesside and the Citygate projects. The look at the Caledonian Clean Energy project at Grangemouth, for example. And then we can imagine with increasing development of that hydrogen network, increasing development of the CO2 transport and storage network, we bring on more capture, particularly through the production of large volumes of hydrogen for the north of England. And we've also considered, because this is after all a European project, we've also considered the potential for import of CO2 from Germany and Belgium via the Netherlands, in collaboration with our partners, TNO, in the Netherlands there as well. Next slide, please. So this table summarizes the scenarios that we have developed. As I say, it's split into three different levels of potential growth, if you like, or levels of implementation, development of CO2 storage. And the column on the right, so we have a number of different scenarios that charter at sort of different levels of ambition. Again, I'd just like to highlight that these levels of ambition predated our formal statement of intent to achieve net zero that was made by Theresa May in 2018. But what we can see here is a number of scenarios that look at the different levels of ambition that might reflect future energy policy. And from this, we have estimated the amount of CO2 that could be captured per year, depending on the rate of growth, if you like, of the carbon capture networks and the rate of growth of hydrogen production to enable decarbonisation of these other sectors where it's quite hard to look to think of other technologies that could decarbonise, and I'm thinking there particularly of domestic spatial heating, for example. So we have a number of different levels of ambition that, as I say, would reflect all those different scenarios. I think the other point that's worth mentioning on this slide is that you'll see there in scenario 3.3 towards the bottom there that we've included Acorn's growth scenarios for their project, but we haven't really included some of that work in our later developments. And the reason for that is simply because we were very aware that Acorn themselves were doing a lot of work. We had several discussions with the guys at Pale Blue Dot, and we were very aware that they were doing their own work, and rather than duplicate that work, we concentrate on other aspects of the story, if you like. Okay, next slide, please. So here we have the potential supply curves in blue, orange, and green. So the blue being the initial growth, the initial level of deployment, and if we just did a bit, it would remain fairly flat out to 2050. If we had more ambition in orange, if we started to increase the number of capture sites from those initially planned in the industrial clusters of Teesside and Grangemouth, we would get the orange curve. And that would also bring in some of the hydrogen production, particularly for the Leeds Citygate project. And then if we went to a much more mature situation where we were also importing CO2 from continental Europe, if we were having a very significant deployment of hydrogen for the north of England, we get the green curve. You'll also notice that we've put some limited sensitivities on this, particularly from around 2055, when many of the scenarios that we were reviewing, they kind of finished at that point. As I say, we really, in the absence of any other information, we took a fairly flat, conservative, linear extrapolation to 2100. And the reason for that was because we felt it would be difficult to imagine a situation where CCS was sort of stopped completely in around 2050. That doesn't seem very likely if you're going to invest in a lot of this infrastructure over the next 20 to 30 years, and with increasing growth as needed to achieve the net zero targets and achieve the 2°C targets for the UK, then we couldn't imagine a situation where all that would suddenly stop at 2050. But we didn't have really much more information, so we took a fairly flat linear extrapolation there, but then put on top of that a plus or minus 10% to capture some sensitivities around that. What you'll also notice from this slide, particularly in the mature growth, the green curve there, is that the amount of CO2 captured starts to decrease from around 2050. And that's to reflect the increasing production of hydrogen from renewable sources via electrolysis or other technologies, well, mainly electrolysis, let's say, and therefore the amount of CO2 that's captured through the production of hydrogen from steam methane reforming decreases as those hydrogen production methods are displaced, if you like, by renewable sources. Okay, next slide, please. So the storage requirements then for initial industrial projects at Teesside and Grangemouth was estimated to be around 84 million tonnes by 2055, with increasing capture from a broader region, a broader hinterland from those projects, and the initiation of hydrogen production in those regions. We can expect a significant increase in the storage capacity that will be needed to around about 576 million tonnes by 2055. If we think about this wider rollout of hydrogen, particularly for heating and some transport, and the potential to import CO2 from other parts of Europe, then again, the storage capacity will increase quite significantly to around 850 million tonnes of CO2. I think the important point to mention here is that we do have that storage capacity in the UK, but really the point of doing this exercise was to think, how do we actually provide that CO2? That's the real point of the project from at least in the context of these talks today, is we really want to understand how we can actually provide that storage capacity. Where might it be needed? When might it be needed? And that's really what Maxine will address in the next talk. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we started off in the ELEGANCY project trying to look at what had been published already, but we were extremely conscious that as we were doing this, if we all think back perhaps 2 to 3 years, I know that many of you will be aware that there's been a tremendous increase in the conversations and discussions around the potential for hydrogen to offer some real decarbonisation solutions to achieve these net zero targets. So we're very aware of that, and we have now undertaken a new review to update those estimates. And this includes studies such as H21's North of England study, which was published last year, which provides an estimate of a cumulative storage capacity of 516 million tonnes of CO2 by 2060, which will provide considerable heat demand for the UK, up to 14% of the UK's heat demand via autothermal reforming. The net zero Teesside estimates have increased slightly, up to about 13.5 million tonnes of CO2 by 2050. And similarly, we've also had estimates produced by the Humber region, up to around 44 million tonnes of CO2 captured by 2040. And we can also see that for the UK as a whole, with the Committee on Climate Change full hydrogen scenario that they published last year, again, a reasonably significant capacity is required to achieve net zero, estimated of between about 75 and 175 million tonnes CO2 capacity in 2050. So these values, whilst they do show a material increase, they are broadly within the range of the growth scenarios that we were thinking about for this project that I've outlined today. Next slide, please. So in summary, we have produced a series of CO2 supply profiles that looks at the potential storage capacity required to enable capture of CO2 from industrial processes and future strategies for hydrogen for heating and transport. We've done this by combining various studies published by the government's advisors and by various industrial groups. This has been framed within an initial sort of level of ambition, if you like, and then the potential for growing that over time. And this case study is really investigating how the UK can meet future carbon budgets by this large-scale decarbonisation. So really, it's not can we do it, but how do we do it? And as you'll see from the next presentation, this will be explained in a bit more detail. Next slide, please. So that concludes my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Very clear and really, really interesting. You've actually been quicker than expected on the timetable, and I think it's wrong to start presentations early because people like to drop in. I just want to say a couple of things about the project. I think we've got to really think about this, is that this project, the ELEGANCY project, was born during 2016. Didn't start until 2017. In those particular days, we're in a totally different place to where we are now. And I think that is important to recognise. And now this project has come to a close. The other thing is that ACT is an international program, as I said before, and the partners within the ELEGANCY project were Switzerland, Norway, Germany, and the Netherlands. So each of those countries were undertaking similar things to do with this particular area of work. But I'm not going to let you go yet, Jonathan. So just hold on a few seconds. I'm going to give you an opportunity with the 2 or 3 extra minutes that you've gained. Just looking at your bio, okay? You're the chair of the General Assembly of ExCeL, which is the European Network of Large Research Facilities for CCS. Would you like to tell the audience just what that is? Just an opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, so ExCeL is a network of large research facilities that have come together to support the research and testing demonstration of CCS technologies. So it crosses the full chain. So the network has research facilities within it for capture, for transport, and for storage. And we're now evaluating the potential for including research facilities for utilization as well. So the network is actually a legal entity, and there are a number of founding partners, and for various legal reasons, which I won't bore the audience with, that requires sign up by member states, not just individual organizations. And the ExCeL network is currently supported by and is run and operated by Norway. The operational center is based in Norway, but it also includes facilities in the UK, in France, in the Netherlands, and in Italy as well. So many of the partner countries also supporting ACT as well. And so really the whole point of ExCeL is to provide both a shop window for those research facilities, but also to coordinate a sort of strategic agenda for investment in both the existing facilities, and also to identify gaps where new research facilities might be needed, and to coordinate potential investment in those facilities as well. So it's a one-stop shop. I'd heartily recommend people going to look at the website, which is ExCeL, which is ECCSEL. And that will show you a lot of information about the individual facilities, and it allows researchers easy and straightforward access via a one-stop shop process to gain to start collaborating with the research facilities on any particular research or testing that they might need.
Okay, thank you. I did pick on you for that one, but I think it's very important. We have these bios every time, and I think sometimes it's worth just to pick over them a little bit. Could you just very quickly, time is just about to drift away. The UK organisations involved in ExCeL, could you just quickly go through those?
Yes, certainly. So the British Geological Survey, which I'm a member of, we are the national node for the UK. But they're within that, so that's some of our BGS laboratories that are involved. But we're also bringing on stream. We have the PreACT facilities, of course, on the capture side, University of Sheffield, and we're also bringing on stream new facilities, particularly from universities in Scotland via SCCS, which are organising this conference today. So they include facilities from Heriot-Watt and Edinburgh universities and other facilities in Scotland as well. So and we're always looking to expand and would very much welcome new partners across the ExCeL network. We now have something like over 70 research facilities across Europe at the moment. We're always looking at ways to bring on other countries to join and other facilities as well.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. The witching hour's arrived, and it's Maxine Akhurst also from the British Geological Survey to talk about the ALIGN project. Thank you, Jonathan. Maxine.
Oh, hello. Thank you, Brian. Hello, everyone. I am Maxine. I'm a geologist at the British Geological Survey, and I would like to review our research in the ALIGN-CCUS project. And we're looking particularly today on planning for permanent storage of CO2 captured at the UK industrial sites, and particularly the storage options for accelerated emissions reduction at the Grangemouth and Teesside industrial sites. So I'm just going to switch off my camera. And if we could have the next slide, please. So this morning, I would like to introduce the ALIGN-CCUS project. Then I'd like to review our CO2 storage research objectives and our framework to communicate storage site readiness for CO2 storage. Then I'd like to consider our criteria for UK offshore infrastructure reuse, for future storage options for Grangemouth and Teesside industrial sites, and then finally, very, very quickly, review the ALIGN simulation of potential storage option for CO2 supplied from the Teesside industrial site. Next slide, please. So ALIGN-CCUS, or Accelerating Low Carbon Industrial Growth through CCUS, is a large research project led by the Dutch Geological Survey, TNO. It is supported by approximately 15 million euro, of which the equivalent of £2 million is for our UK research partners. The project has roughly 30 research, industry and stakeholder organisations. Our combined research objective is to support large-scale, cost-effective implementation of CCUS by 2025. As you can see from this list here, our project research activities span capture, transport, utilisation and storage of CO2, and implementing social acceptance of CCUS in society. Can I have the next slide, please? So ALIGN considers the integrated full chain industrial CCS, so US. And today, our focus is on CO2 storage research, here highlighted in Work Package 3, and its application to the Teesside and Grangemouth industrial sites at Work Package 4. And both of these, the Work Package 3 and the Teesside and Grangemouth investigations are led by the BGS. Now, there are UK research partner activities in the other work packages, and I encourage you to visit the project website and the project at the ALIGN wiki with the links here below. Can I have the next slide, please? So our ALIGN CO2 research activities for storage are to present profiles of planned CO2 supply from industry published plans and concepts, and that then sets the storage challenge. We seek to identify cost reduction and acceleration of opportunities for CCUS for Teesside and Grangemouth. And these include reducing uncertainty on the availability of future storage capacity, testing, applying and ranking published criteria for infrastructure reuse, and identify storage options to meet North Sea storage demand for our 2 UK industrial sites. We will then have a look at simulation of CO2 storage options for future large-scale hydrogen reformation and industrial CCS at differing rates of CO2 storage project growth. And this is one of the links that we have with the ELEGANCY project. Okay, so if we can then look at the next slide, please. Thank you. So Jonathan from the ELEGANCY project has set the storage challenge and provided us with the profiles of CO2 supply for storage from the Grangemouth and Teesside sites. As we have seen in the previous presentation, for the Grangemouth site also includes the ACT ACON project storage plans. And here we see again the plotted integrated CO2 supply for both industry sites as anticipated up to and including the middle of the summer in 2018. And there are three variants of initial, growing and maturing CCS projects that equate to roughly either low, intermediate and high rates of CO2 storage project deployment, because much as we would like it, sort of large scale implementation of CCS, things never quite go as you plan. So I gave ourselves three alternatives. And note that we have plotted our profiles from the present day to the year 2100. So as Jonathan has pointed out, we are thinking big. Could we go to the next slide, please? So where to start? There are more than 570 potential CO2 storage sites around the UK in the National CO2 Storage Database, CO2 Stored. So to reduce uncertainty on the availability of individual stores as future storage capacity, ALIGN has developed a communication tool, a framework of CO2 storage readiness levels as illustrated here. And the levels communicate the current maturity of understanding, that is, how ready a site is for storage, and those actions remaining before a site can become operational. It is modelled on the well-known technology readiness levels. It is applicable to all types of store and at local, regional or national scales. And our work draws on the experience and planning of, and operating of North Sea storage sites since the 1990s in the UK, Norway and the Netherlands. It is based on our knowledge of more than 740 prospective North Sea storage sites across the North Sea sectors. So assignment to a storage readiness level of a store informs what has been completed at that site and, very importantly, what remains to be achieved by site appraisal, permitting and project planning for it to become operational. The framework of levels is designed to be compatible with the commercial project management system of industry, but it extends it to incorporate those needs for the development of national storage resources and strategic appraisal. And is intended that our communication tool is used by technical and non-technical users and that it be widely applied. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So to accelerate and reduce the cost of CCS, we can also consider oil and gas infrastructure reuse for CO2 transport and storage. So ALIGN reviewed published criteria produced by industry and research organisations for the screening and selection of infrastructure for reuse. A methodology was developed by our ALIGN research collaborators in the UK, Norway and the Netherlands. We tested the criteria on our respective national infrastructure datasets. Then we ranked the criteria on their ease of use and their effectiveness for screening of suitable infrastructure. And overall, that we found that the ranking of criteria was similar for each country. Can I have the next slide, please? So here is our ranking of published reuse criteria. We found the most effective and easiest to apply, and we have ranked that one. And going down to the bottom, the least effective and the most difficult for screening was then, and difficult to access, are ranked at 7. We then applied our ranked criteria to the storage sites investigated in our project in our national storage portfolios. What we found was infrastructure needs to be available at the right time and in the right place for reuse for CO2 transport and storage. We particularly noted examples where fields have been depleted within a time frame suitable and unsuitable for CCUS reuse. We also noted where production of oil and gas will continue in the coming decades, and so limiting its possibilities for reuse. Or we noted that fields have been depleted and some infrastructure has been dismantled before it is needed for CCS. So to address loss of suitable infrastructure before CCS becomes operational, ALIGN has proposed that there should be appointed either an interim entity or an operator of last resort to maintain suitable infrastructure until it is needed for CCS after production has finished. Could I have the next slide, please? I would now like to review the ALIGN work on future storage options for the Teesside and Grangemouth industrial sites. And these are our criteria for selection of storage options. Firstly, I think it makes sense that the site should provide adequate storage capacity beyond that planned by current industry profiles to meet future demand. The injectivity of the storage reservoirs should of course be sufficient to meet the planned supply. The sites should be in relatively close proximity to the industrial site, and they should have been characterised to a sufficient level for planned early injection, that is at higher storage readiness levels. They should have the potential to be included in an integrated storage network, and the network should accommodate future expansion. For example, it might wish to import CO2 from other sources within the UK or externally, for example, from Rotterdam. Really importantly, there must be existing 3D geological models and data available or obtainable by the project to enable us to complete detailed simulations by the project within the timescale and within project resources. Next slide, please. Although Grangemouth is in central Scotland, there are many pipelines connecting it to the North Sea oil and gas pipeline terminus at St Fergus. So our focus for storage is on the adjacent Merry Firth for storage development because of its proximity to St Fergus offshore pipeline, and also to enable us to expand to both the central and North Sea areas. So taking our work from the ELEGANCY supply profiles for the volumes and rate of CO2 to be supplied, for those initial project scenario for Grangemouth, the rate would be at around 1.7 million tonnes per year, operating from the present to the year 2100, with a cumulative storage capacity of around 140 million tonnes. The growth scenario has an increased capture rates, injecting at 8.6 million tonnes per year for the period 2025 to 2100, with a cumulative total of 654. With the mature scenario of accelerated injection rates starting at 4 million tonnes, increasing to 8 and then 16 million tonnes per year, with a cumulative total of around 1,000 million tonnes, or indeed a gigaton. Next slide, please. So several projects have recently conducted screening exercises for stores in this area and also investigated storage options. So we have proposed storage for Grangemouth in 4 sandstone storage sites shown here. The Captain Sandstone West and the Forties 5 sandstone sites were investigated by the Strategic Storage Appraisal Project. The East May sandstone was investigated by ALIGN. A Captain Sandstone East site we have modelled in the ALIGN, including and incorporating the understanding gained by the operation of 2 sites within the Captain Fairway from the CO2 multi-store project. And the planned ALIGN project's Captain Sandstone site is the first to operate, and so is our anchor storage site in our modelling. Next slide, please. So, for the Teesside industrial cluster, our focus has been using a storage network based on the structural closures in the Bunter sandstone. Again, the volume and rate of CO2 stored are based on the ELEGANCY supply profiles we have already seen. For the initial projects, injection is at a rate of approximately 5.6 million tonnes per year, operating for a 76-year period and requiring a cumulative storage capacity of around 428 million tonnes. The growth scenario injection rate is approximately 8 million tonnes per year, with a cumulative total of approximately 600 million tonnes. The mature scenario has modelled CO2 storage in 5 storage sites, and we have a target storage capacity of approximately 1,900 million tonnes. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So projects that have previously conducted screening and investigated storage options in this area are the Crown Estate Site Portfolio Project, the Strategic Storage Appraisal Project, and of course the White Rose CCS projects. Our priorities for site selections are that they are in relatively close proximity to Teesside. They have previously been evaluated by feasibility studies, and the endurance structure as planned by industry will be our anchor site. Then we would then consider closure 36 as a second site, as this has also been investigated and by the Strategic Storage Appraisal Project. The storage options investigated for Teesside are all in the Bunter Sandstone, in Bunter Sandstone Unit 4, shown on the map. And then we have an expansion from our two initial sites, our anchor and second site, with up to 5 sites. And as part of our investigation, the role of a seabed outcrop, as also shown on the map, has also been evaluated. Next slide, please. So taking a strategic approach to storage design, storage options for CO2 from both the industry sites have been modelled for technical feasibility. In the initialisation of our models, the simulation of CO2 injection, it has emphasised the importance of understanding the model boundary conditions and the pressure responses to CO2 injection. Our model pressure management activities have included constraining the injection rate, considering the role of a seabed outcrop at Teesside, and also modelling of water production at Grangemouth. Our simulations of injection for both industrial sites have included the 3 variants of supply of different rates of CCS project deployments included in our many runs, and also considering multi-site storage options. And we have then modelled those to meet those future UK CO2 storage ambitions. So then if we could go to the next slide, please. I'm absolutely going to gallop through some of this work because we have lots of work that's condensed into a couple of slides here, but let's give it a go. So we will now very quickly look at an overview of the simulation of storage options for Teesside in ALIGN. Here is our model at the top, our geological model of the central part of the Bunter Sandstone saline aquifer Unit 4. The storage sites modelled are the endurance structure and closures 36, 37, 39 and 40 in the Bunter Sandstone, and also the seabed outcrop as labelled. The orange and yellow coloured areas are regions of the sandstone with distinct and different properties. The differing regions were attributed from core plug analysis data, including from 23 southern North Sea wells. The porosity permeability cross plot at the bottom shows that the yellow area is both more porous and more permeable than the orange coloured area, but note that both have wide ranges of values, and we use this information to attribute our model. We conducted many injection runs in our simulations using different connected aquifer volumes, different number and position of injection wells, and we considered base case, low and high storativity cases based on the wide ranges of values, such as that's shown on the plot here, to reflect what was most likely, then perhaps a pessimistic or an optimistic case. The simulations were constrained by fracture pressure and including the seabed outcrop, and they show that it is technically feasible to store the required volumes of CO2. That the pressure increase due to injection is mitigated either by dissipation of pressure at the seabed outcrop, or if the outcrop is close to brine flow, by water production wells. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the simulation of injection of the ALIGN CO2 supply scenarios have shown that it is theoretically possible to store around 1,900 million tonnes of CO2. So these volumes easily accommodate the initial and growth scenarios for Teesside that we saw earlier from ELEGANCY, and it just about meets the mature project scenario ambitions as well. This is a conservative approach, as this simulation does not take into account residual trapping or hysteresis. So taking our strategic approach, the theoretical volumes simulated significantly exceed the current plans for Teesside to store 380 million tonnes. So although that looks very hopeful, we have to note that our strategic modelling assumes injection into 5 hydraulically connected bunter sandstone closures, the physical properties as attributed from the available core plug data, that there is a regionally extensive hydraulically connected aquifer, and the pressure increase is mitigated either by brine flow at the seabed outcrop or by water production. And we recommend that additional investigations should further assess presence of existing hydrocarbon exploration wells, further consider the regional hydraulic conductivity of the pore space, and also the permeability characteristics of the wider aquifer. Next slide, please. So to summarise, in the line CO2 storage work, we have presented profiles of CO2 supply anticipating future demand for storage capacity from the Teesside and Grangemouth industrial sites. We have reduced uncertainty on the available or future storage capacity using CO2 storage readiness levels to communicate maturity of understanding and those remaining actions needed for a storage site to become operational. We have reviewed published criteria for infrastructure reuse, tested, applied, and ranked them to identify those criteria which are most effective and easiest to apply. We have identified storage options to meet storage demand for our 2 UK industry sites. And we have simulated storage options, which we have seen for Teesside, at differing rates of low and intermediate and high CO2 storage project deployment and multi-site storage to accommodate potential future UK ambitions for CO2 storage. ALIGN-CCUS doesn't just cover storage, but of course, as mentioned earlier, it involves capture, transport, utilisation and social acceptance. So I encourage you to learn more about the project, the research findings, outcomes and events by looking on the project website, as shown here, and also the ALIGN Wiki, which summarises all of the project research. It highlights interactions between the work packages and provides links to the deliverables. Next slide, please. Now I have a live poll question. I would like to ask you, on behalf of both myself, ALIGN and the Elegancy project, do you have the Elegancy and ALIGN CCUS finding increased your confidence in the availability of UK storage capacity to reduce emissions by CCS into the future? So I just ask you to select one, please. I think I have a few minutes for you to deliberate. So yes, that has the presentations increased your confidence. No, they haven't, or you don't know. Please vote. Well, thank you very much. I can see the correct answers now. Thank you very much. I'm glad that you have been reassured that we have the storage capacity and that we are doing something about it and to be able to make it effective and available. But I still encourage you to, again, to have a look at the website and at the wiki to see those aspects of CCUS that I really haven't been able to cover today. Okay, so if we would like to go to the next and final slide, please. So I'd like very much to thank the funders. So we have received much funding, and we have in particular, I would like to thank BEIS who have supported the many UK partners who I have not been able to mention here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maxine. Maybe we'll come back during the questions and answers and see what we can do, or what you can do, to address the 20% that weren't convinced. And I think that's always a useful approach, maybe. So for the third BGS presenter today, we have Jim White, and he was the project manager, or is the project manager, of the PreACT project. Jim, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. As Brian says, I'm Jim White. I'm a geophysicist at the British Geological Survey and the UK lead for the PreACT project. Firstly, on behalf of PreACT, to say thank you to SCCS and ALIGN for hosting this event today. So I'm going to talk a little about quantitative conformance at CO2 storage operations and highlight some of the approaches that have been adopted as part of the PreACT project, and bring this forward using a case study that we've developed as part of the UK side of this work. So I'm going to start by looking at the sort of structure of PreACT, provide an insight in some of the work we've undertaken to improve our understanding of various subsurface processes in their various guises, and hopefully show how we can use this information in the construction of a suite of geological models that will enable us to test quantitative conformance tools that we've developed as part of the project. And these models, I say, will be based on a UK case study. And I was very pleased to see there that Max has been showing some of the work on the bunter, which we've also looked at in collaboration with ALIGN and ELEGANCY. And we can make use of this where BGS are looking at the sort of regional storage target of the bunter sandstone. And crucially here, we're looking not really to make use of the models themselves in a specific way, but more in the generic nature that we can parameterize them in that allow us to test the work that PreACT's undertaken. So we're looking to populate them with subsurface realistic distributions that provide different expressions of the subsurface properties following CO2 injection, so we can demonstrate how conforming and non-conforming sites might behave relative to each other. And with that, I'm going to turn my camera off and I'll ask for my next slide, please. Thank you. So, like ALIGN and ELEGANCY, the PreACT project was funded from the Accelerating CCS Technologies call in 2016. And we are the largest storage-only project that was established during that round of funding. And our aim really was to identify and address the main storage-related challenges for the accelerated deployment of CCS as we saw them back in 2016. This is a key work here that most of our focus is through collaboration with industry. So we have a fairly significant industrial component here. And we focus on the sort of crucial challenges that we see being capacity, confidence, and cost. And alongside the more traditional standard monitoring techniques that were adopted up until this point, PreACT had a clear focus on the modelling, monitoring, and understanding of pressure, which we believed would be an early indicator of non-conformance that we could use alongside other monitoring schemes. So the objective of PreACT really is to equip operators and regulators with a series of pressure-driven support protocols that we call the PreACT protocols, and an example of which will be presented here today. Next slide, please. Thank you. So PreACT brought together a unique group of research and industry with a key focus on North Sea storage. The project is multinational and has significant support from our 4 industrial operators, Equinor, Shell, Total, and TAQA, and brings together 6 key research groups from Norway, the UK, Holland, and Germany. Thank you. Next slide, please. So the approach of PreACT really can be summarized in the image that is shown here on the right. We've got a clear focus in the early work packages 1 and 2 on the modelling, the monitoring, and the understanding of pressure and saturation changes associated with CO2 injection. And then taking the learnings that we make in these work packages from demonstration, pilot, and field lab data, and synthetic studies that we undertake, we feed these through into work package 3, where we're trying to equip operators and regulators with the tools to provide quantitative understanding of conformance. So what we really require here is a series of models that mimic CO2 injection and the associated pressure and saturation changes, so we can test the work we develop in work package 3 and allow us to make some decisions in work package 4. And the way we do this is through the back of this image, work package 5, our workflow demonstration tools. And these are established through our case studies. Within the project, we have 3 major case studies, 1 in the UK, 1 in Norway, and 1 in the Netherlands. And these seek to highlight the links between the work packages of the project. For example, work package 1 has been doing some fundamental research looking at pressure sensitivity during CO2 injection and providing key learnings that we can assess through our monitoring tools in work package 2, where we can look at how the subsurface changes can be identified through the parameters that are measurable to monitoring tools, and feed this through into the overall development of our ensemble-based conformance techniques. Next slide, please. So quickly, I'll work that we've done in some of the work packages before we move on to the case studies. And these are really establishing the tools that will allow PreACT to develop the conformance protocols that we'll discuss later. The initial effort here looked at the understanding of the role of subsurface heterogeneity. This is key for us because this was one of the things that could influence our model ensemble suite and would be a key dictator of whether our site was expected to behave as we'd anticipated. And here are two examples from the project. On the left, we were investigating the role of fault transmissivity, and what we see working on here is the Smacktites site offshore Norway, looking at open, partially closed and closed fault structures and the effect that that has on the pressure distribution that we see in the subsurface, and whether that site will have the capacity to take significant CO2 injection as a consequence of this. And on the right, we see the role of geological heterogeneity in the reservoir, and looking at this in terms of the dissipation of pressure during CO2 injection, and in the image I think shown here, building an understanding of the consequences for water production from a series of five-point well system that we've adopted, and how the actual subsurface distribution can have fairly significant consequences for the extent of certain pressure boundaries. Thank you. Next slide, please. And then we take these forward, and work package 2 really had a focus on this sort of discrimination of pressure and saturation changes. And I would refer to this paper by my colleague from SINTEF here that you should look at, and the various work that was undertaken to disentangle the consequences of CO2 pressure and injection, and the development of inversion schemes to establish the limits of detection for pressure changes and how we can separate them from the much larger effects that we see from saturation changes, particularly on electrical and seismic monitoring approaches. And these studies have been published on the theoretical developments that we undertook here, but also on the site-specific applications, and the hope being that the results are transferable as they determine the sensitivity of each of the components and the uncertainty limits that we need to overcome in the measurement process in order to say clearly what's been causing those changes that we see in our monitoring data. And the nice thing here is that this was tested during a measurement campaign. Next slide, please. So PreACT was very lucky and was responsible really for the reopening of the Svelvik CO2 field lab. We had the first experimental campaign here and re-established the site as a sort of major infrastructure project for CO2 research. And what we had really were pressure and saturation discrimination tools that we could test and verify using this novel experimental program. So we had an injection well in the center of these 4 wells that you see in the image on the right, down to the order of 65 meters, and we injected at different times brine and CO2 to look at pressure and saturation variability in the subsurface, and how using our observation wells, which were instrumented for seismic, ERT, pressure, and also fiber optics and fluid sampling, how we could determine the response to each of these subsurface changes. And these were key in establishing both the site itself, but also in determining the new direction for experimental campaigns that are now being undertaken in the next phase of projects that are going forward. Next slide, please. And I think some of the key learnings that PreACT was responsible for, really, as part of this, was that the initial results have established the structure of the site, and the cross-hole experiments have affected the consequences of the changes on our different monitoring tools. And what we've noticed really is that by adopting wavelet analysis approaches, we can differentiate the pressure and saturation changes, primarily due to the sort of broad consequences of the structure of the wavelet, rather than the first arrival time. These are quite key developed as part of this work. So I would encourage you to go and look at some of the work on the PreACT website, assessing what was undertaken here and what would be possible for the research community at this site. I think the development of these pilot sites is a really interesting concept at the moment as we move forward into large-scale CO2 storage, and the results here I think are particularly applicable beyond the scope of the project that we see. Yeah, next slide, please. So if we move on now and look more specifically at the conformance and cost-effective monitoring strategies that we've worked on, and the full-on establishment of the PreACT approach that we adopt for the rest of this talk. Next slide, please. So one thing that we're keen to sort of point out wherever we get the chance as part of PreACT is that conformance itself at a site is the meeting of a set of site-specific criteria. The key thing to know if a site is conforming is that the observed behaviour, so the measurements that we make, are in compliance with the expected behaviour to our model predictions and with the regulations, and that any conformance statements that we make must account for uncertainties both in the models that we have and in the measurements that we record. We've seen in the past at demonstration sites that we've had conformance and non-conformance. We only have to look at the example perhaps of Snowbit to see how a site may initially comply with expected behaviour, but then later require actions to bring it in line with an acceptable performance. So PreACT has studied the role of conformance at a range of demonstration and pilot sites and have published our findings relative to this interesting topic. And it's clear that what we need is that conformance statements have got to be probabilistic. It's very difficult to say yes or no at an early stage how a site will end up behaving, and that it is very case specific in the way that we define our conformance, both in terms of the criteria that we must adopt and in terms of the way that we interpret our results. Next slide, please. So how are we going to assess this? Well, any information that we will hold will be incomplete, indirect, and uncertain. And this is just due to the nature of the amount of information that we can record. These factors will, to a different degree at different sites, depending on the money we have, and the location and timing of things that we undertake, be more or less fulfilled to the level that we would hope to receive. And what we're going to do here is take an ensemble approach to the verification of conformance. What that means in terms of modelling uncertainty is that we'll have an ensemble of reservoir model realizations, for example, our geological scenarios, and we'll have a quantitative assessment of the conformance. We must have modelled results to benchmark any true results we have against. So the ensemble of realizations is generated which account for the uncertainty in the geology, the models, the monitoring data, and the interpretation. And the suite of models will be site dependent, and I suppose really as large as necessary to optimize the trade-off between the uncertainty and the computational requirements. So we really need something, and this enables us to make a model-based quantitative assessment of our monitoring strategies. So what does this really mean? Well, we have a large set of plausible models weighted to the expected distribution of that plausibility, and that allows us to model the expected behavior at the site. And then by comparing the observing data with our range of models, we can then make some statements about how the site will perform going forward and how likely that site is to continue displaying conformance or non-conformance criteria in the future. Next slide, please. So I really produced this sort of fairly simple set of schematics, so we're going to flick through these quite quickly to try and demonstrate the approach. On the left here, the truth, we have an observed scenario, and we can record data that gives us information about this. And this may be seismic data or downhole data or some other monitoring scheme. But this data is incomplete and will be subject to certain uncertainties. And then we can also have an ensemble of models. And this represents our understanding of the storage site. And the number here I've chosen is arbitrary, but we can model injection across all of these scenarios and generate data that's equivalent to that we record at the true scenario. Next slide, please. But the conformance is that the site is meeting a set of site-specific criteria. So for each member of that ensemble, we know over its entire lifetime whether that will result in a conforming or non-conforming site, marked here as green or red. Next slide, please. And so at certain times, we can choose to make an assessment, and we can run, for example, some sort of survey, and we can see how many of the models in the ensemble give us interpretations that are equivalent to that observed in the true scenario. And if our ensemble correctly replicates our understanding of the site at a given time, this gives us a path to a quantitative conformance assessment at any stage in the project lifetime. So here we see it's a fairly equal distribution between conforming and non-conforming sites based on the comparison of the true scenario with members of the ensemble. Next slide, please. However, at a later time, a different subset of models in our ensemble are in agreement with the monitoring data from the true scenario. And as time goes by, we would expect that we'll converge on a correct assessment of where the truth will end up. Next slide, please. So what we find generally is that the fraction of false positives will fall over time. And this means that at any given time, we can provide a quantitative assessment of conformance that an operator can use in their risk assessment to establish the likelihood of a site behaving in the future. And in PreACT, we've shown that we can provide input into the optimal time to undertake surveys for the most cost-effective approaches. And we can also rank the benefit of different monitoring strategies against each other. Next slide, please. So we really need to understand the subsurface, and I will, seeing as Max has touched on this, I'll go through this fairly quickly. We need to make sure that our ensemble correctly reflects the plausibility of various subsurface scenarios. So in the UK, we're working in the southern North Sea, and the primary target here is Bunter Sandstone, a long-term target for saline aquifer storage, and was previously the target of 2 UK government incentivised CCS projects. It's also home to the endurance cluster, which Max touched on, and we're going to use the actual structure of the endurance as a tool to construct models to demonstrate our protocols. Yeah, next slide, please. And on the right here, seismic data is the key to our interpretation of the subsurface. And the image, I think, shows the ease with which we can interpret the storage formation. But what we see in here is a change in the polarity of a seismic signal. And essentially what this means is that in order for a change of polarity, there must be a change in the properties of the rock. It's altering its acoustic impedance. And similar to what Max showed during her interpretation, we can also do some core plug analysis, looking at the porosity and permeability. We can relate that to this mapped phase reversal. And on the left, what we see is the extent of this using yellow and orange, and the sort of change in properties that we see to the north and south of the Bunter mapped around this phase reversal. And the south, including the endurance structure, seems to have much cleaner sand of higher porosity and permeability, suggests a better candidate for CO2 storage. Next slide, please. So working with the ALIGN project, we've documented this analysis for further regional assessment of the southern North Sea. And we can see a clear shift in the distributions of porosity and permeability inside and outside of this phase reversal. These are displayed in the image here, showing the orange and the yellow distributions, which are reasonably bell-shaped. And what this allows us to do in terms of the construction of our ensemble of models to test the PreACT protocols is that we can use these distributions to give realistic values for the reservoir properties. And nicely, it also improves our regional understanding of the Bunter going forward, so we can undertake regional pressure modelling perhaps, and look at future linked CO2 injection sites at a range of storage sites and clusters. And it allowed us to feed directly into the discussion of the use of pore space in the southern North Sea. For our purposes, next slide please. We're interested in the top reservoir surface in and around the endurance structure. So injection will take place in the crest of this structure in all our models that we're going to talk about. A key component of the model here is the seabed outcrop, where pressure buildup can be released into the water column. And this is likely to be one of the key conformance criteria that we could adopt later, no CO2 leakage through this pathway. And the models are run with both open and closed boundaries in our examples to limit the size of the regional aquifer and provide additional data for our conformance tests. What you see here, the sort of unfolded nature of this, is due to the salt diapirism in the underlying salts. Next slide, please. So we take a different view of the structure. Injections via the blue well in the center of the crest. The red wells, the multicolored wells surrounding it, provide a 5-spot pattern that set up our monitoring system for downhole work. The first conformance criteria that I'm going to point you to is defined as the red line that sort of sits halfway down the endurance structure. This is not going to actually result in CO2 spilling out of the structure, but is chosen as our limit for CO2 movement that we would accept as part of our conformance criteria, and also provide an early warning of CO2 movement towards the spill point. Next slide, please. And the second conformance criteria is pressure related. So looking at the model in map view, we can see how the fracture pressure is controlled by the cap rock topography, with the crest of the storage enclosure having the lowest fracture pressure, with the exception of the seabed outcrop. And we find that we state that if the pressure exceeds the fracture pressure, then failure is deemed to have occurred and conformance is deemed to have failed. So they are our two criteria, the sort of previous slide and this fracture pressure distribution. Next slide, please. So here we see some examples from isotropic models used in our work. We modelled injection in each case for 76 years of CO2 injection at around about 4 million tonnes injected through a single well over the entire reservoir interval. And the models incorporated a bottom hole pressure cutoff so that we were not exceeding 75% of the lithostatic pressure. And the 4 monitoring wells on the flanks of the structure were used to provide pressure monitoring data, as well as act as potential brine producers in some of our later models. These models were parameterized based on data we saw previously for the Bunter sandstone analysis. Next slide, please. And to complement these models, we also had a range of anaxotropic models. And these models are designed to produce a heterogeneous CO2 plume and pressure footprint. And the porosity distribution here was generated using sort of random Gaussian functions based around the same set of statistics that we saw previously for the Bunter. What we see is various different elongate plumes that fill the topography in different ways. So we have now a whole suite of models that we are using to best represent the subsurface for us to test our conformance protocols, but that I want to state do not necessarily match what we expect to see in the subsurface at endurance. Next slide, please. So if we look at a single model quickly, this is one of our isotropic models. We run the model through the lifetime of its injection cycle, and the image on the left shows a plot of the change in pressure from the pre-injection models, seeing the greatest changes observed in the crest of the structure. And by applying a fracture pressure conformance criteria, we can see where this fails in the image on the right. Normally we'll exclude the seabed outcrop. Next image, please. We can also look at the CO2 saturation distributions for a closed and open boundary version of this model. And we see that in one, the open boundary, we sit neatly within the conformance bounds, and the other, we actually exceed it. So this, okay, Brian, I've got 2 minutes yet, 2 or 3 minutes. But we don't have monitoring data. Next slide, sorry, please. We don't actually have monitoring data at all times over all of the model. So we extract plume footprints and simply record data along the 2 axes here shown in the black, the long and the short. And after 40 years, it's reasonably clear where we're heading. So in this example, crossing the red boundary is taken as non-conformance. Next slide, please. But if we were to make our assessment earlier in the lifetime of the project, it's difficult to differentiate where we will be heading. So we can make use of our ensemble of model predictions and our probabilistic conformance assessment. Next slide. And use this alongside our geophysical monitoring techniques, where we can clearly see the extent of the CO2 in the bottom image. Next slide. And if we take a single model to represent the truth, or a series of single models to represent the truth, we can compare our monitoring response at set times and look at where results lead us to the correct conclusion of conformance. And the ensemble here is used to capture the likelihood of an accurate prediction. We can see, as we expected, that the graph on the right shows that the example assessed along the long axis falls dramatically with time, allowing us to provide information on the most suitable time to undertake measurement campaigns, improving site cost effectiveness. Next slide, please. However, if we undertake these assessments on the short axis, it's difficult to differentiate the model results, giving us a way into optimizing our monitoring strategies. Next slide. And I'll quickly just touch on the pressure response. Here we have lots of downhole pressure monitoring data with steady rises observed across all of our monitoring wells. Next slide. And if we take these models, or a single one of these models to represent the truth, and basically base that assessment by comparing that model against the other models, we can capture the quantitative likelihood of an accurate prediction by comparing the downhole data and the associated uncertainty over the lifetime of the project. And again, we see that the fraction of false positives drops with time. That allows operators to define their own acceptable risk in a quantitative way. Final slide, please. So in conclusion, I think PreACT here has worked at various things, but what we've touched on today is an increased understanding of the bunted storage complex and the development of methods to construct a suite of realistic subsurface distributions. We've also provided quantitative conformance tools with a generic methodology for quantification of monitoring effectiveness. So it's originally conceived for reservoir-oriented applications that can clearly be tailored for application-specific detail purposes. And it can be extended to much more complex conformance cases and multiple conformance categories, so how we actually interpret this data. And with that, I will leave my talk. Thank you very much. Those slides are more for the discussion later. So,
okay, thank you very much, Jim. Very well explained. It's certainly for the likes of a civil servant, very complex. And thank you very much.
Yeah.
Before I go on to the final presentation, can I just remind you that you can place your questions into the chat, and we've already received some really good ones, and we'll obviously answer those a little bit later. But in during the next presentation, see if you can come up with some more questions. It would be really useful. Obviously, paying attention to our next speakers, which are Andreas Busch and Florian Doster, who are from Heriot-Watt University and are going to explain more about the DETECT project, an integrated CO2 risk assessment. So let's see what you come up with this afternoon. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Brian, and welcome everyone. So we are doing a bit of a sandwiched approach where I'm starting with the presentation and the middle part will be taken by Florian, and I will conclude this presentation. So let's quickly get started. I mean, the three previous projects are really large-scale projects. The DETECT project is very much focused on a specific feature that is relevant for CO2 storage, and this is fault leakage. We are working with a small number of partners, which is Heriot-Watt University. The project is led by Shell. We are working with Aachen University in Germany and Ristech Solutions in the Netherlands. So you see all the contributors to this project on the list below. It's quite a few. I'm not naming everyone, and we have been working with numerous external partners as well that have greatly contributed to this project. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, what we are looking at, so we are looking at natural defects in the overburden, so to say. That's fault zones and their likelihood for CO2 leakage. So basically, when we are injecting CO2 into a saline aquifer, we are increasing the pore pressure, and we are also changing the chemical equilibrium. And we are looking at the consequences on potential fault leakage. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the motivation, as I mentioned, is really to look at that single feature of fault leakage. The approach we are taking is 3 to 4 ways. So we are looking at the physical chemical interactions of fluids with fractures, and we are determining that in the laboratory. We are looking at field analogs that might be representative for the North Sea, so to get relatively realistic fracture networks or fault zones. We are then feeding all that information into coupled and upscaled modeling approaches that is then going into monitoring requirements to actually detect potential leak rates, so changes in pressure, temperature, and saturations. And all that is then feeding into a bow tie risk assessment. Next slide, please. This is how it looks like, very schematically. On the right, we have work package 2. So the project consists of 4 work packages, 4 technical work packages. Work package 1 is the management. And work package 2 is what I've been working on mainly is the laboratory and field aspects of looking at fault zones, and we are providing input data for the modeling, what Florian is presenting later in this talk, where we are going from very small scale modeling, really on the fracture scale, to medium scale, which is the fracture network, then to reservoir scale, so the largest scale that we can look at, all relevant for the North Sea. All that information is then feeding into the monitoring to see what sort of monitoring tools are most adequate. And then, as I mentioned before, the risk assessment in the form of a bow tie scheme. Next slide, please. So to get started, so before it would be good to have a Q&A right at the beginning, and I'd like to ask the audience the following question. So what do you think, under which of the following circumstances does a fault pose a risk to leakage across the primary caprock? So is it that we are having only few large faults that are clearly visible in seismic, or that we are having many small faults that are at sub-seismic resolution, so we actually don't see them? Is it faults in brittle rocks, or is it faults in more ductile rocks? So what do you think? Not sure if you can actually give multiple answers. So if you cannot, then just pick the one that comes to your mind first. So which one of these would have the biggest effect on fault leakage? That's a good one. So it is what we were hoping a bit for, that the ductile mud rocks, that they are mostly sealing. Small faults, absolutely the ones we cannot see. So we might just drill our injection well right next to small faults that hasn't been observed in the seismic survey. But then, of course, the big ones are the ones that are most prone to the biggest, volume flow of leakage if there's leakage occurring. So can we get back to the presentation? Thanks for this, everyone. Next slide, please. So let's get started with looking at fractures and fracture flow and mineralization. Next slide, please. This is work that is mainly done at Harvard University and Aachen University. So we've been looking at a couple of field sites where we obtained samples, but where we also did field work to come up with fracture networks. So this is Carmel Shell. This is in Utah. We drilled a core into a fault zone there a couple of years back. We looked at tight carbonates onshore in Brazil with all our collaborators there. We looked at Opalinus shale from Switzerland in Monterey. We looked at UK analogs for caprocks, that's Mercer mud rock, that's Kimmert shale. And we worked with the University of Svalbard to look at the fault zone that is nicely exposed there. Can you click a few times, because there's a couple of pictures coming just every second, like a click. So this is Mercer mud rock, Brazil carbonate. One more, please. This is the model of Green River in Utah, where we drilled the well. One more, please. This is a tunnel outcrop of the Opalinus shale, the main fault in the underground there. One more, please. This is again Mercer mud rock at the Bristol Channel, the southern side at St. Audrey's Bay that we looked at in August. And one more, please. And then the Konusdalen fault in Svalbard, which has the advantage that it's most of the year it's actually deep frozen, so it's not weathering so much. Next slide, please. So for fault leakage or fracture flow, we identified 3 different physical chemical mechanisms that can have an impact on fracture flow. The first one is pressure. We are increasing the pressure in a reservoir when we are injecting CO2. The second one is chemistry. So we are changing the chemical equilibrium, and once CO2 saturated fluids are leaking for fracture and we are decreasing pressure and temperature by getting closer to the surface. CO2 is exsolving from the fluid that leads to carbonate supersaturation and then precipitation that is observed in nature everywhere. Very often that can lead to clogging. And then we have swelling clays, and the expansion of swelling clays can lead to a decrease in fracture aperture. And these are the three processes we looked at in detail. Next slide, please. So let's get started with stress permeability. On the upper left, you see a plug sample that we use in laboratory testing that contains a natural fracture. And you see the roughness, you see the tortuosity. In section B, you see how that schematically would look like with the roughness. Very irregular, very difficult to characterize, while for modeling, these sort of things are usually very much idealized. And on the lower picture, you see how that could look like in 3D, where we have the tortuosity and the roughness. We have different disparities from the upper and the lower side of the fracture that might even touch each other, which is changing the fracture porosity, which is changing the flow field. So all things that are usually not considered in modeling that we wanted to study a bit more. Next slide, please. So for that, we did a lot of laboratory testing of fracture flow under different stress conditions. So we put the sample under subsurface stress and changed the pore pressure. Basically, with an increase in pore pressure, we increased the permeability. And you see from the picture in the middle that permeabilities can vary by order of magnitude 7 to 8 orders of magnitude, which is quite a lot. But if we look at the mineralogy and the mechanical properties of these rocks, we find that the high permeability ones are usually the ones that are very brittle. So low in clay content, high in stiffness, while the ones that are very low in permeability, so close to matrix permeability, are usually those that are high in clay content and rather weak. And we consider them basically to be self-sealing. So we use this lab data to parameterize them to come up with pure fracture permeabilities that then serve as input data for the modeling. Next slide, please. We then looked at roughness. I mentioned before that typically in modeling, fracture flow is looked at as kind of a parallel plate kind of system with a very simple flow relationship. But the reality, of course, looks different, and the reality has roughness, and this parallel plate concept might not be relevant, especially for the more rough fracture, stiff kind of rocks where we see high roughness. Next slide, please. So we therefore used a very neat approach to characterize the roughness of these fractures on natural rocks using a confocal microscope. And we also printed samples that have different roughnesses. And this roughness is basically can be expressed as the joint roughness coefficient, which is looking at the asperity height and the asperity differences on the surface, and can be characterized in full numbers. So you can have a low roughness is somewhere between 0 and 2, that is very close to a straight line, or you can have high roughnesses, a joint roughness coefficient of maybe 80 to 20, where the roughness is a very wiggling number. Next slide, please. So we used printed material with different joint roughness coefficients to see how that is affecting permeability. And as you can see in this outputs that joint roughness coefficient somewhere between 2 and 9, we see that the permeability is increasing with roughness, but that is mainly a factor of 2, maybe a factor of 3. But if we are getting to a joint roughness coefficient of 10, so just a bit higher, then we see a change in permeability on the order of magnitude scale. So this is, of course, for the fracture permeability, and then likewise also for the hydraulic aperture. So a very relevant parameter to quantify. Next slide, please. The next set of measurements we did that was done at Aachen University is looking at mineralization, and it's very well known that depressurization results in degassing of CO2, saturated fluid. and that is leading to calcium carbonate or any kind of carbonate supersaturation and then precipitation. It's relatively simple to confirm that numerically, but there is definitely a huge lack of experimental verification of the model predictions of that. And this is what the aim is of this sub-work package. So specifically, we looked at the effects of saturation, the effects of mineralogy, and also the effects of flow rate to see how porosity and permeability are changing. Next slide, please. As a first step, we used a capillary flow experiment. So it's quite a complicated setup where different fluids are getting mixed, and fluids get saturated with, for instance, salt or with carbonate. And these fluids are then flowing over a long capillary where we have a certain pressure gradient across the capillary, but also a temperature gradient. And what we observe is that at a certain point along the capillary, when we get a degassing of CO2 and then supersaturation of our salt or of our carbonate, we start getting precipitation of grains. And that is then, of course, leading to a clogging of this capillary and a decrease in permeability. So this is a bit the verification of kind of what we wanted to see. Next slide, please. And to make that a little bit more relevant for subsurface conditions, we used two different approaches. The one is a glass bead approach. So looking at precipitation or nucleation of carbonate on different mineral surfaces. So we know that carbonate likes to nucleate on carbonate. So we used glass bead models that consist of 100% of just quartz. And then other models that consist to a certain degree of carbonate to really look at the preferential nucleation of a calcium carbonate on these carbonate grains. And then we used naturally fractured rocks, so the same ones that we tested in this other sub-work package, to see calcium carbonate precipitation within the fracture and as a function of the carbonate content of the rock. Next slide, please. So what we clearly see is in the glass bead model that when we are having calcium carbonate as a specific layer in there, we mainly get specific nucleation on the carbonate grains in there. You see that on the right-hand side, the picture. This is a column experiment where the upper and lower part are just quartz glass beads and the middle part is carbonate. And we get preferential carbonate precipitation in the carbonate section that is leading to a decrease in porosity, but also to a decrease in permeability by at least 1 order of magnitude within the time frame of the experiment, clearly showing that this effect is very much relevant for subsurface conditions. Next slide, please. The last thing we looked at experimentally is swelling clays. It is known that there is a certain type of clay, typically a Smacktite, that is prone to swelling. So it changes in volume depending on the chemical equilibrium in the subsurface. Next slide, please. And it was shown previously that specific clays can change their volume by 20 to even 30%, depending on the clay type and the hydration state of that clay. But it was never really tested if that is actually leading to permeability changes under full water saturations. And this is exactly what we tried to do in this sub-work package. Next slide, please. So what we first did is looking at the CO2 uptake capacity of different Smacktites or swelling clays. And we typically find different types in the deeper subsurface. So some might be a calcium exchange, so they have a slight different chemistry, and some are sodium exchanged. And we looked at basically the absorption capacity of CO2 on these clay minerals as a function of relative humidity, going from very low relative humidity to basically full water saturation. What we clearly find is that very close to full water saturation, the adsorption capacity is lowest, and it actually approaches the pure CO2 solubility of CO2 in water, kind of indicating that this process under subsurface conditions is not very relevant. Next slide, please. In a follow experiment, we used a plug that consists up to 100% of swelling clays. We did a couple of permeability experiments. As I said, it was done at Aachen University, where we first injected just pure water, giving a permeability of 1 nanodarcy. Then we co-injected CO2, showing that the permeability isn't changing. We then injected brine, so at a certain salinity, and did the same again with brine and CO2, again showing that the permeability is actually not changing as a consequence of CO2 migrating through that sample. That kind of provides evidence that the swelling, a change of in fractures has no effect and has not further been considered in modeling. Next slide, please. So the next bit is what we looked at fracture characterization from outcrops. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, again, this is looking at the inside of a fault zone where we have a slip surface right in the middle that is surrounded by a damage zone, and that damage zone has a different fracture density, fracture orientation, fracture connectivity, and so on and so forth. And this kind of architecture depends our flow rate and as such our leak rates, which is something we wanted to understand a bit better. Next slide, please. We again looked at the different outcrops or the different case studies that we analyzed, but you know, for the sake of time, I will only present one, and this is Opalinos shale. Next slide, please. So Opalinos is, or Monterey is an underground laboratory in Switzerland that is looked at for radioactive waste storage. And within this underground laboratory, there have been different tunnels drilled through Opalinos shale. And 2 of these tunnels, they cross-sected the main fault there. So that provided us with 4 different kind of windows where we could look at the fault zone in very much detail. And this is what we did. Next slide, please. So this is one of the detailed mapping that has been done on one of the sections, just as a case example that was done by Swiss Topo, the Swiss Geological Survey, that we worked with quite a bit. So what we first did in the first step is to basically get a digital representation of that fault zone section. Next slide, please. To then using FracPack, which is a software tool that has been developed at Aberdeen University, and that gives us a statistical representation of the fracture network that we are seeing. So for instance, we are getting the trace length in terms of histograms, we get the fracture orientations on the right-hand side. And on the next slide, please. We are also getting the fracture connectivity, so in the different modes. So we can have I nodes, so those are usually not connected. X nodes, they are cross-cutting, and Y nodes, they are ending up with another fracture. Very important for the statistical analysis and then the modeling. We also get densities, either per meter or per area, so in the terms of square meters. So it's all outputs that we got for many of these analog outcrop models that we looked at, and that is then feeding to numerical modeling, which is now presented by Florian.
Thank you, Andreas. And I'd like to start my presentation with a question again to the audience, and that is, are there off-the-shelf software tools and workflows to model phenomena related to CO2 leakage? It's a simple yes/no question, and I hope within a few seconds you will be able to quickly click what's your take here. Okay, so the polling is over. So it's of course a bit of a suggestive question, because if the answer would have been yes, what 30% actually answered here, then very likely this work package would have not been funded through ACT. So can you go to my presentation back? Yeah, so the challenge is actually twofold. It's first, geometrically, it's very difficult to represent fractures which live on a length scale of a few millimeters to centimeters and meters in this in a modeling endeavor when we're looking at a reservoir scale on the order of kilometers and want to also look at times that last for centuries and millennia. The second aspect that poses a challenge in terms of modeling is the complexity of the interacting physical processes that Andreas nicely lined out at the beginning of this talk, like the chemical reaction, temperature interaction, mechanical interaction, and at the end what we are interested in is does CO2 leak the complex, so very much a flow phenomenon. And because of this complexity and because of the lack of really covering the detailed modeling approaches for flow in fractures or fracture networks around the damage zone of a fault, we will have to take an approach of varying complexity to at the end be able to come up with a model on the macro scale that we can assess the quality of that model and the sensitivities towards parameters that we can quantify through experiments and field studies. So at the micro scale, as Andreas showed, we can have a relatively reasonable understanding because we are able to do experiments in plugs. However, when we are talking on the fracture network scale, things become more complex because what Andreas showed a lot in his field studies were two-dimensional outcrop studies of fracture networks, but looking at the Monterey windows, we're talking here about a few meters, like in width and length. However, true fracture networks are obviously 3D entities, which we only know from, which we can only infer statistically. So the modeling job is then to incorporate the structure of these fracture networks, take the move forward the understanding on the fracture scale and feed that then into macro scale models that allow us to test sensitivities for and assess the risk of leakage through in the vicinity of faults. So next slide, please. And can you just fill the slide, please? So yeah, so like if we translate there's one more click. If we translate the problem to questions at the micro scale, we are interested in what are the permeabilities or transmissivities of individual fractures in typical cap rocks and their sensitivity to stress. Again, Andreas has shown experimental work, but in order to investigate the vast parameter uncertainties that go in, a modeling approach is more or the experimental work has to be complemented by modeling approaches. And so these are single phase properties, but at the end we have to also look into multi-phase properties, and that is essentially what are relative permeabilities and capillary pressures of an individual fracture and how are they sensitive to stress. If we then go to the mesoscale, we want to address the question, what are typical fracture networks in the damage zone of faults? And what are the effective permeabilities of those fracture networks, and how do these effective permeabilities respond to stress? And then the same question as on the microscale, what are relative permeabilities and capillary pressures of these fracture networks, and how do they respond to stress. And now when we are, as we are moving away from our microscale experiments, the model uncertainties become larger and larger. Even though we're doing careful assessments, the only true benchmark is at the end if we can compare our findings with field tests or even better operations. And so again, Phil, please, the slide. And I've missed the last item on the previous slide. No need to go back. Then, of course, the important, like for getting started on CO2 storage, the big question then will be what implications do these findings have for CO2 storage operation? And then for the sake of time, I will just like rush over these slides. So what we did is, in terms of varying complexity, we first started looking at 2D cross-sections of fractures and investigated the impact of roughness, different roughness characterizations, and how that translates into a permeability response. For that, we developed our own coupled mechanics flow solvers in the MATLAB reservoir simulation toolbox. This is, of course, a simplification with 2D, so we went to a simpler modeling approach in 3D. So we anchored our 3D simplified modeling approach in 3D against our 2D modeling assumptions. We did the same exercise for multi-phase flow then with upscaling on, Andreas mentioned, the 3D printed fracture surfaces. So we used our approach to take the same surfaces and obtain stress-dependent relative permeabilities and capillary pressure. And one click, please. We also took so this is very costly, and this is very costly, so we had to take a simplified approach, and we also developed methods to quickly assess the breakthrough capillary pressure. And next slide. We did, in order to model the fracture network simulations, we developed modules for the MATLAB reservoir simulation toolbox, and I highly encourage you. This is all open source and freely available. So next slide. We then took the fracture networks from the Monterey underground laboratory to obtain upscaled permeabilities on these fracture networks. Next slide. We expanded these and anchored again against these 2D. So the 2D simulations were coupled, strongly coupled with the mechanics. We simplified the coupling, did it in 3D, obtained upscaled stress-perm relationship. Next slide, please. And we did the same approach for multi-phase flow. Next slide. And then, so I was rushing through to spend a little bit more time here on the benchmarks. So what we, so in the Monterey test site, they also did a field test, a well test injecting fluid and observing how the pressure responds to obtain the permeability next to the fault. And what we did now is take our workflow, take the fracture networks, and obtained an upscaled permeability for that. And what I want you to focus on are the gray diamonds here. These are the field tests, and for at various depths, and our and the open triangles are on the were our upscale tests, and we see that at least we are on the same order of magnitude, and we are conservative in the sense that we are overestimating the permeability. Next slide. So then the second and maybe more relevant benchmark is the Green River natural site in Utah. This is a natural leaking reservoir of CO2 with a fault, and we have experimental data measuring the CO2 flux at the surface. And again, we applied our modeling workflow. Next slide, please. And what we see is here in the bottom left, a comparison of field measurement in the bottom right and a modeling approach in the top right, in the more left side. And we get the total mass rate match, and we get the location matched. So this gives us confidence to, next slide, please, to apply the approach to the Captain Fairway. And my colleagues from BGS are probably much more capable in detailing the geology of that site. We are applying our workflow here. The sensitivities are currently running, but next slide, please. Hello? So what we can see is now, so we can model the take our modeling and experimental data into a field scale model and represent faults and the permeabilities around that, and are able to do a proper risk assessment on that. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Andreas again.
Thanks, Florian. To round this off, if you can go to the next slide. Especially the reservoir modeling that we did, or the upscaled reservoir modeling, then is feeding into monitoring requirements that is done by or has been done within Shell. Next slide, please. So, I mean, one of the critical things is, of course, if we get leakage, the question is, can we observe that leakage with monitoring tools available, and what sort of monitoring tools would be most adequate? So that comes with a big cost element. So you can shoot with the big bazooka on your CO2 storage site, but just applying or deploying everything that is there and available. But that is, of course, not cost effective, and monitoring is one of the most expensive things when we are doing CO2 storage. So we need to be as realistic as possible, and this is exactly what is done here. So with all the upscaled modeling, we are then coming up with different scenarios, so best case and worst case scenario. It's a bit shown here in this picture. This is for temperature. So when we're leaking across a catwalk, we are changing the temperature depending on the leak rates. We are seeing different temperatures at the top of the catwalk, and this needs to be observable. So is the temperature change 0.00001 degree, or is it 0.1 degree? And how does that match to monitoring requirements? So this is something we have done here. And then the next slide. Our colleagues in Shell have basically put together for the specific topic of fault leakage kind of a characterization of the monitoring tools that would actually make sense in that regard, and those that are realistic and those that would be able to observe the sort of predicted leak rates that we would expect across a catwalk. Next slide, please. All this is then feeding into the risk assessment, which is qualitative and quantitative. The quantitative is, especially the quantitative one, is the kind of a new development within bowtie risk assessment. Next slide, please. And to give you a quick idea of how that works, so very generalized, we typically have a hazard that is leading to a top event. And the left-hand side of the bow tie is giving us the threats that we need to prevent from causing the top event. And after we have had a top event, we need to mitigate the consequences. And in a real case scenario, if you click once more, The hazard is, of course, CO2 injection, and the top event would be release from storage site. So at the threats would be faults or fractures, could be wells, could be lateral migration that we need to prevent, either actively or passively. And of course, the consequences could be people impact, environment, and so on and so forth. Can you click once more, please? This is very important for communication, also with regulators, for understanding the integrated processes. It gives a holistic representation, and it also documents the weaknesses of the approach that we are looking at, or basically the lack of understanding of the subsurface. Can you click once more, please? So this is the daughter bow tie for what we are looking at, the leakage along faults and fracture networks. And these are the barriers to prevent that leakage from happening. So for instance, we try to get our well as far away from faults as possible, or we need to have very ductile shale that are self-sealing, things like that. Can you click once more? So if we look at geological properties, and next one, please. We then come up with our 3 different kind of processes that can change the flow along fractures. Next one, please. And the work that we did was basically used to characterize the impact on these individual flow processes. So we talked a lot about fracture roughness, can also be clay content, can be the chemistry, the amount of carbonate within the cap rock, and so on and so forth. So each of those have a different impact on the flow itself. Next one, please. And that is then used to come up with or leading towards a quantitative risk assessment, to kind of making a decision tree to see what sort of parameters, to look at the parameters that we have and the parameters that would be safe or worrying at the end. And the quantitative risk assessment, which I'm not showing here, might be shown. Can you click once more? In a full detect event that we are hosting next week on Tuesday. So if you want to get all the detail, then click in there. Please be quick in registering for that event. There's only a couple of seats left. And apologies for being a bit late. So this is us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andreas and Florian. Just to say that you introduced this particular project by saying it is a small project compared to the previous 3. As you can see, everybody, that it may well be a small project, but there is a lot in it. And I do recommend this particular event for next week, which you'll be able to go into more detail of what you've heard today. Could I ask for all the speakers to come back onto screen, please? And we'll use the last 20 minutes to ask and answer some questions, I think. Everybody there? Excellent. In no particular order, I'm gonna kick off from probably the furthest question that we've got today. It's coming from Japan, and the question is aimed at Jim. And the question said, did the analysis by PreACT have any effect on the change of storage structure of the Northern Lights project from Shmita to Aura?
Thanks, Brian. So the Smaher site is the Norwegian case study that is undertaken as part of PreACT. So our Norwegian partners at Sintef led that, working closely with our industrial partners, Shell, Total, and Equinor, who are obviously responsible for it. And the work that we undertake was run in conjunction with what they were undertaking. The final decision to make the move was not the responsibility of PreACT, although obviously we were feeding our findings into that project there. What I would say is that Smaher still provides an option going forward. I think the reason for the move to the Johansson was primarily to reduce uncertainty in the storage, because what we see as part of our modelling and theirs is that there is a risk of higher pressures as the CO2 moves and the pressure dissipates, depending on how big that fault block is and the overall extent of the pressure dissipation. So yes, we are working closely with the team there and the research group as part of the project, but the actual decision was not made based on PreACT, but obviously working with those partners, it gives us a chance to feed into those decisions.
Okay, thanks, Jim. We'll probably come back to other questions towards you. Let's pick another one. The question is there scope for including CCS from direct air capture in future? Who would like to pick that one up?
I can have a go at that one, Brian.
Okay.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, it's a good question. So I actually should have mentioned this, but so the questioner is quite right. There was no assessment of the amount of CO2 that might be required for storage coming from direct air capture, nor did we actually include any bioenergy CCS either in our scenarios. That's certainly something that we should definitely be looking at in the future. Obviously, DAX is relatively immature technology. The amount of direct air capture that might be needed is not, I don't think, particularly clear for the UK yet. I know that the Committee on Climate Change, for example, are looking at that issue, but we weren't able to include any results of that in this project in these scenarios. BECS, of course, is kind of part of the plans, if you like, for CCS in the UK with the DRAX project and the Humber net zero projects there. So that's certainly part of the project, and both DAX and BECS are possibly going to be needed in the future to create some headroom where we can't fully decarbonise in other sectors. So yeah, it's a good point, and they're not included, and we would like to include such capture scenarios in the future.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Is there any views from anybody else?
Okay, Brian, this is Maxine. I can just make a comment there. Although increasingly during the duration of the ELEGANCY and ALIGN projects, DAX and BECS were increasingly mentioned, they tend to be more from the top-down perspective. So it says by a certain date, the UK will be using negative emissions technologies by using BECS or DAX, and it will be to capture a certain number of million tonnes for storage, but without saying, you know, where it's going to be, when it's going to be, at what annual rate. It's difficult for us to be able to include them in a sort of a supply profile that we would then match to a storage site. So we didn't overlook it completely. It's just the information we could not accommodate in the way that it was required to plot and to calculate our profiles of annual supply and cumulative storage capacity.
Thank you very much, Maxine. Let's have another question. Probably back to you, Maxine. At ALIGN, did your project look at potential induced seismicity?
And actually, it's very easy to say, unfortunately, no, we didn't. What we did do was to make sure that the amounts that we were looking, the amount of the volumes that we were injecting, the rates that we were injecting, we looked at different levels of pressure thresholds. So we took conservative base case and also sort of optimistic values using different levels of lithostatic proportions of lithostatic static pressure gradient. So we had an indication as to the likelihood of reactivation to produce induced seismicity, but it was not something that we specifically addressed. But we could look at our different levels of percentage pressure threshold with the lower values, which I think are preferred by industry. That would minimise the fault reactivation and so then induced seismicity. Always something to do something in the future, Brian.
Okay, thanks, Maxine. Jim?
Just as an aside, PreACT did have some work looking at that. We had an acoustic emissions laboratory programme that we ran as part of it, and our colleagues at NORSAR were trying to attribute some of the results from that to field measurements as part of CO2 storage. So there is a body of work undertaken as part of the first round of the ACT calls that is relevant to that.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Thanks everybody on that one. Quite a long question, this one, so I'll read it slowly for you. Well, slowly for me, really. With the UK requiring between around about 70 to 90 gigawatts of offshore wind in 2050, how will the work from ALIGN and ELEGANCY be used to inform emerging discussions about the net zero use of the offshore, where offshore wind and CCUS will be competing for the same seabed space?
I can have a quick go at that one, Brian.
Okay, Jonathan.
Yeah, it's another excellent question. I mean, the questioner is quite right. There is going to be well, not competition, but let's say co-usage of the seabed. We know that with phase 3 of the wind licensing round, a number of wind farms or areas of the seabed are now licensed that are coincident with subsea storage, deep geological storage. That could increase again in the next phase 4 of the wind farm licensing system. I think what the results of the ALIGN and ELEGANCY project do is they highlight those potential storage sites that could be used in the future, that certainly let's say the regulators and the leaseors of those potential areas must take into account when they're evaluating the applications for wind farms. We have had, as part of these projects and just general conversations, and some discussions with particularly organisations like the Crown Estate in England and Wales, and I know that they are definitely very much aware of this issue, and we are thinking about ways that we can make it easy for them to assimilate the results of these projects. So yes, it's a good question, and something that personally I think does require quite a bit of thinking about from a sort of strategic resource point of view.
Thanks, Jonathan. Anybody else have a view on that? Okay, let's move to how about a question for Andreas and Florian. Under what conditions do faults pose a risk to leakage?
Yeah, I can start with that, and maybe Florian has something to add. So I mean, it's still not 100% solvable. So I mean, first of all, of course, it very much depends on the pressure. So that determines, so in that sense, it depends on how away the fault is from the injector. So if you're close to injector, we're of course seeing higher pressures, and that is of course posing a higher risk for leakage. But what is also found is that rocks, for instance, generally rocks with high clay contents that are more ductile, they tend to self-sealing. So that means that the permeability is unlikely to be increased significantly above matrix values. So that makes it relatively safe. But if you have more brittle rocks, high surface roughness, then we are actually creating pathways for fluids to flow along the fault. So that's probably from our current findings some of the major discoveries, but that is of course a question that we can discuss over hours. Anything to add, Florian?
Yeah, I can add one short comment on that. So the flow rates tend to be super low in the fracture networks, and so that gives a lot of time for CO2 to actually dissolve into the surrounding brine. And CO2-rich brine is denser than non-CO2 or like CO2-poor brine. So this is another mechanism that potentially slows down and mitigates the risk.
Thank you both. I think it's still with you two. Did the study consider access to seal rocks from North Sea cores and their use in lab experiments?
We did not have access to real North Sea cores. So the problem is a bit that when cores are being drilled, they might be readily accessible and usable in the laboratory. But typically these cores are then getting stored in a core shed, and then during dehydration, they simply fall apart. So that makes the cores relatively useless. This is why we use the analog material, like from Monterey, like outcrops from Mercia mud rock in quarries in the Midlands, for instance, or at the coast, things like that. So wherever we could get good core material, we use that as analogs, but not directly from very fresh drillings from the North Sea. No.
Okay, thank you.
So that's specific to mud rocks. Like
that's very specific to mud rocks. Sandstones would not be such an issue.
Okay, thanks. Back for Jim. Has the project looked at the AVO response of CO2 injection and plume development in the bunter?
So as part of the work we did in our sort of work package looking at monitoring techniques, the use of AVO, so amplitude changes as you with offset on your seismic data, is one of the key tools for differentiating the effect of pressure and saturation in the subsurface. In terms of our bunter study, it wasn't one of the options that we employed as part of that assessment, but as part of one of the other case studies, it was chosen as a tool there in terms of a tool to differentiate the two. So the idea being across our sort of suite of case studies, different options were chosen for different parts of the work. So we had some looking at containment, some looking more at conformance, and then different tools used in terms of our approach really was a reasonably sparse monitoring approach, looking at fairly basic seismic and a little bit of downhole data to show what could be achieved with those tools. But yes, as part of the work, we have done a fair bit of work looking at AVO and inversion for pressure and saturation changes and what results will be required in order for that to be successful. And in addition, we've also reviewed that from some of the demonstration sites. So there's a body of work published on that at Snowbit, which PGS have contributed to in the past, looking at the effects of AVO for disentangling the pressure response there.
Thank you, Jim. Getting close to the end of our question and answer session, but got plenty of questions to ask. We'll see how many we can get in. In understanding the subsurface, particularly of existing fields, what is the possible balance between existing well stocks providing the necessary subsurface information?
I'll start if you want. Yeah.
Go on, go for it, Jonathan.
I'll go first. Yeah, I think from our point of view, anything that allows us to better characterize the storage complex is greatly appreciated. So we are very much looking at going forward, testing the tools that PreACT developed on in a depleted field environment where we can basically narrow the constraints of what we're expecting from the subsurface. So where we have well parameterized field models, where we have core available, where we have the sort of understanding of the flow processes that's been developed in the past, that is likely either from partially from exploration wells, but also from sort of field well stocks. That to me would be something that we could take forward and really eliminate a lot of the uncertainty that we see in the models that we're creating as part of this project. So that will be my take.
Thank you, Jim.
Brian, if I can,
for it.
one of the things I was alluding to towards the end of my presentation on ALIGN is that we have attributed our ALIGN geological and simulation models using core plug data. And at first glance, that sounds very reassuring. Oh, it's real data, it's real information, it's measurements, you know, this is absolutely great. but that is a weakness in itself, in that the cores are drilled for a specific purpose. So if we're, for example, the challenge in ALIGN was to look at all of those closures in the Bunter Sandstone, for example, and we would then use what core measurements we had to attribute it. But of course, nobody drills in a grid pattern to have a nice uniform, not influenced by any other bias. So the cores that we have, as Andreas has pointed out, they've been produced for specific reasons for oil and gas exploration, and basically they will target the most porous and most permeable. So yes, we would use core information, but we have to be aware that the core information itself, the collection, has a bias in that they're still looking for the most porous and permeable, and we need the sorts of information and the techniques that Jim has been describing to enable us to sort of correct that bias, to be able to say, you know, okay, there are heterogeneities, but it's difficult for us to measure them. What's the probability of them occurring? So this is something that, although it sounds good, there is some caution with using all available core data.
Okay, thanks, Maxine. And I'm going to stay with a question for you, Maxine. Yeah, as you know, I've been the person with my colleague Hannah Lord monitoring these projects for BEIS and for the ACT program, and I've always been very keen to ensure that you know, what you're doing will actually mean something in the real world in terms of the position we actually are now with CCUS in the UK. So for Maxine, how has ALIGN CO2 storage research accelerated implementation of CCS in the UK?
Okay, so Brian, I think, well, apart from, you know, we can thanks for the SCCS who've been very good at disseminating our information. We've actually had quite a lot of feedback on, you know, of interest, if you will. So for example, the storage readiness levels, we have already started realizing that people were using them. It's really helpful for those people that are not technical. They're not oil and gas sector people. They're already starting to use it as a way of it's a communication tool. So informally, even though it's not yet published, that is already being used. The infrastructure work, we were able to use that to respond to an oil and gas authority consultation on infrastructure reuse. Very hearteningly, we've had a lot of interest on our regional scale modelling, because of course we can see there's potential storage capacity. So we've had a lot of interest both from industry and academia wanting to know the answers, wanting to know our results, because of course, you know, it takes a while to get our storage sites appraised, and therefore we need to look a long time in advance which one is next. And this is what we've been doing in sort of our ALIGN approach, which store is next. If I'm allowed to be a bit cheeky, I'd like to also mention the business case work. Sorry, Brian, this isn't CO2 storage. The business case work that was done by Sustainable Decisions Limited, to looking at the risks and liabilities, the concerns of stakeholders with investment, and the implication of the liabilities they take on. And really that work in Work Package 5 has been of great interest to industry and has already been communicated to the Cabinet Office. So I'm very pleased to say that many aspects, I can't talk about capture and I can't so much, but it's been of great interest, and already we feel that people are using our results, and of course we're using them for future research proposals and other collaborations as well.
Thank you, Maxine, and we've now come to the end of the webinar, so I need to just finish off. And thank you very much for excellent questions, everybody, and also for in-depth and clear answers. I do appreciate that. I would like to thank everybody who's joined us today. As you heard, one of the questions came in from Japan, so it's far and wide. And to the presenters and to the organisers for making this possible today.
And to you, Brian, for moderating it.
Pleasure. Once the webinar ends, we'll give you a link to a survey, good old surveys. We would appreciate if you would complete that and send it back to the organisers. You'll receive a follow-up email with a link if you want to see this again to this particular recording. On behalf of everyone who's involved today, have a great afternoon, keep safe, until next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye everyone, thanks for joining.
Thanks everyone, bye.
Bye everyone.